What's gaming, gamers? Today I've got a Prismatic Warlock build for you using the exotic helmet Fallen Sunstar. This Prismatic Warlock build is designed specifically to spam all of your abilities as often as possible. It makes use of Devour, weapon perks, origin traits, the Monte Carlo exotic auto rifle, and more. I'll be honest, when I first put this build together, I didn't expect too much, but I was blown away. Not only by how fun it is to play, but also by the fact that it's actually a decent build for soloing different activities. There's near infinite uptime on your abilities, healing isn't an issue, you get free damage resistance. All in all, it's a really fun build to play with in low to mid difficulty activities. But before I get into the build itself, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities, all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us, the link is in the description. To get started with the video, I'll first go over the entire build prescriptively. I'll tell you exactly what to run for every part of the build, and once I've done that, I'll describe why you should run each element of the build, and more importantly, what each element does. Firstly, run the Fallen Sunstar exotic helmet. For your Prismatic subclass, run the Strand Needlestorm Super, the Solar Phoenix Dive class ability, whichever jump you prefer, the Strand Arcane Needle melee, the Arc Storm Grenade, the Void Feed the Void aspect, the Arc Lightning Surge aspect, Facet of Awakening, Facet of Balance, Facet of Dominance, Facet of Purpose, and Facet of Sacrifice. For the Episode Revenant artifact, use the Concussive Reload mod, the Kinetic Impacts mod, the Rapid Impacts mod, and the Trace Evidence mod. For Episode Revenant tonics, use either the Diluted or Refined Tonic of Amplified Arc. For armor stat distribution, I have 32 mobility, 102 resilience, 62 recovery, 71 discipline, 30 intellect, and 80 strength. For the armor's mod setup, on your helmet, run 1 arc siphon mod and 2 kinetic siphon mods. On your arms, run 2 heavy-handed mods. On your chest piece, run 1 arc, 1 solar, and 1 void resistance mod. On your legs, run 1 invigoration mod, 1 recuperation mod, and 1 void weapon surge mod. On your bond, run 2 outreach mods and 1 time dilation mod. For weapon choice, in your kinetic slot, run the Monte Carlo exotic kinetic auto rifle. In your energy slot, run the Forbearance Arc Waveframe Grenade Launcher from the Onslaught weapon pool with the perk combination of Ambitious Assassin and Chain Reaction. In your heavy slot, run the Edge Transit Void Grenade Launcher from the Onslaught weapon pool with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Envious Assassin. With the prescriptive build now detailed, I'll describe the entire build in detail, starting with the Fallen Sunstar exotic helmet. Fallen Sunstar has the exotic perk Ionic Conductor. Ionic Conductor will cause any ionic traces you create to move faster, and grant you double their default energy gains upon their collection. Furthermore, when within 10 meters of allies, collecting an ionic trace will also grant those allies ability energy for all 3 of their abilities. It's really that simple of an exotic. All it does is enhance your ionic traces. However, that's a fantastic benefit for this build, and I'll explain how that is throughout the video. Now that you know what Fallen Sunstar does, I can describe to you what each chosen subclass element does. Firstly, the Needlestorm Super will release 7 to 9 tracking needle projectiles on cast, which embed themselves into any target or surface they hit. Once embedded, they'll explode after a short period, dealing damage and summoning a Threadling. These Threadlings then seek out enemies, and they deal 41.5% more damage than normal Threadlings do. Needlestorm is a decent super overall. It's a one-off super, meaning you press the button once and it's over. This is good for this build, as it'll let you use your abilities more often without losing out on your ability loop like some roaming supers can do. However, Needlestorm isn't necessarily chosen for being Needlestorm. Instead, it's chosen for being Strand. Needlestorm being a Strand super means it will synergize with the Facet of Purpose fragment to grant you Woven Mail, as well as the Forbearance Energy weapon to grant you melee energy. But I'll get into more detail about those when I get to the Fragments and Weapons sections respectively. Onto your class ability, the Phoenix Dive, when cast in the air, will cause you to dive towards the ground. Once you've landed, Phoenix Dive will grant yourself and nearby allies the Cure ×2 buff instantly. Phoenix Dive is chosen simply because it's a very quick way to grant yourself the Cure ×2 buff. This will heal you instantly for 120 health, massively increasing your survivability when you're at low health in an engagement. Neither of the rifts are all that great with this build. They both require standing still in one spot to get the most use out of them. This build thrives on being mobile, moving between enemies swiftly, and using abilities over weapons to deal with those enemies, making both of the rifts just not worth using. For your melee ability, Arcane Needle will throw a Seeking Strand Needle at an enemy. This needle will track the enemy you throw it at, and upon hitting its target, will damage them and apply the Unravel debuff to that enemy. Arcane Needle is chosen as it grants you 3 melee charges for use with your Lightning Surge aspect. Having 3 charges allows you to build up multiple charges in between encounters, which then allows you more opportunity to kill enemies at the start of the next encounter. Admittedly, having 3 charges doesn't do much in the middle of an active engagement, but it does allow you overhead to ensure you're not wasting any of those precious percentage points of granted melee energy from all of the available sources. Unfortunately, Arcane Needle's base recharge rate is 30% slower on the Prismatic subclass than it is on Strand, but that's hardly noticeable with how much melee energy this build can generate actively. Onto the grenade, the Storm Grenade will call down a surge of lightning strikes at the location of the grenade's impact, dealing damage to any enemy caught within its radius. A short time after the first strikes, a barrage of lightning bolts will also appear, causing further damage to any enemy caught within that barrage's lightning. The Storm Grenade is chosen merely because it's another source of arc damage to generate ionic traces. That's really the only reason it's chosen. Any of the damaging grenades would work with this build, but none of them generate ionic traces, so the Storm Grenade is the clear choice. Onto the aspects. Firstly, Feed the Void will grant you the Devour buff instantly for 10 seconds upon defeating any enemy with any of your abilities. Furthermore, Feed the Void will enhance your Devour buff, granting you double the amount of health and grenade energy as you'd normally get from the default Devour buff. Anytime you get a kill with Devour active, you'll regenerate 200 health, be granted anywhere between 9.38% and 25% Storm Grenade energy, and the Devour buff itself will have its duration increased by 5 seconds. Feed the Void is a fantastic aspect for this build. Its healing potential will keep you alive so long as you continue to get kills, and its grenade energy gains will regenerate your Storm Grenade very quickly, similarly as long as you're getting kills. Second for aspects is Lightning Surge. Lightning Surge will allow you to use your melee ability while sliding, which will warp you forwards and will call down lightning strikes upon having warped forwards. Lightning Surge will deal damage to any enemies hit by the lightning it calls down, and any enemy damaged by the lightning will also be instantly jolted. Lastly, after using Lightning Surge, you'll be granted the Amplified buff for 15 seconds regardless of whether you hit an enemy or not. Lightning Surge is the primary ability to use with this build, and as such, its uptime is important. Getting kills with Lightning Surge itself will summon Ionic Traces, which will serve to return some melee energy to you. Additionally, the Monte Carlo exotic auto rifle will work in tandem with Ionic Traces to ensure your Arcane Needle is charged as often as possible, allowing you to use Lightning Surge as much as you want. To get into the fragments, firstly, Facet of Awakening will cause the rapid defeat of enemies with any one specific damage type to create an elemental pickup that matches that damage type. Facet of Awakening does come with a 5-second cooldown between generating the same elemental pickup, meaning you'll only be able to get an Ionic Trace from Facet of Awakening once every 5 seconds. However, that's still a net boost to your overall Ionic Trace generation, further increasing your ability uptime. Additionally, Facet of Awakening comes with a 10-point boost to your Resilience stat, which is a great stat to have an extra 10 points in. The second fragment, Facet of Balance, will cause the rapid defeat of enemies using light damage to grant you a base 10% melee energy, and the rapid defeat of enemies using darkness damage to grant you a base 10% grenade energy. For this build, however, getting rapid light damage kills will grant your Arcane Needle 6% energy, and rapid dark damage kills will grant your Storm Grenade 6.25% energy. You won't be getting rapid dark damage kills with this build nearly ever, so the grenade energy gains are unimportant. And while the 6% Arcane Needle energy may seem small, that's additive to every single other melee energy generating aspect of this build. Plus, you'll be getting rapid light kills almost constantly with this build in the form of the Storm Grenade, your Lightning Surge melee, and the Forbearance Grenade Launcher, so you'll see Facet of Balance's melee energy gains quite often. Third for fragments is Facet of Dominance. Facet of Dominance will cause your Arc and Void grenades to jolt or weaken any enemy damaged by that respective element's grenade. Facet of Dominance simply serves to increase your Storm Grenade's effective damage output, as the jolt effect itself deals damage to enemies it's applied to. Having your Storm Grenade deal more damage increases its ability to get kills, in turn increasing the likelihood you can proc Devour, generate Ionic Traces, and dispatch enemies. Facet of Dominance does come with a 10-point deficit to your Discipline stat, but that's effectively nullified by this build's use of the Devour buff. The fourth fragment, Facet of Purpose, will cause the collection of any orb of power to grant you a buff that corresponds with your equipped super. Facet of Purpose has no intrinsic cooldown, meaning the more orbs you generate, the more you'll be able to get a super element matching buff. With this build specifically, Facet of Purpose will grant you the Woven Mail buff for 5 seconds upon the collection of any orb of power. Woven Mail will grant you an extra 45% damage resistance to all incoming damage for its duration, significantly increasing your overall survivability. Facet of Purpose does come with a 10-point deficit to your recovery stat, but that's negligible as Woven Mail itself will reduce the overall amount of damage you take, and the Devour buff will keep you healed almost constantly. Lastly, for fragments, Facet of Sacrifice will cause any ability final blow while you have a light buff to grant you an extra 1% Darkness Transcendence energy. That 1% figure may seem small, and frankly it is, but it's really the only way in which this build can actively generate Darkness Transcendence energy. Furthermore, you'll be getting ability kills constantly, and that 1% figure isn't limited to once per ability use. If your Storm Grenade gets 4 kills, you'll get 4% Darkness Transcendence energy. Thus, the more kills you get with your light abilities, the more Darkness Transcendence energy you'll gain. Furthermore, Facet of Sacrifice has the stipulation of requiring a light buff to proc. Fortunately, with the Feed the Void aspect equipped, any ability Final Blow procs Devour instantly for you, meaning you never have to think about actively proccing a light buff for the purposes of Facet of Sacrifice. Lastly, Facet of Sacrifice comes with a 10-point boost to your Discipline stat, which simply increases your Storm Grenade's passive recharge rate. As for alternative fragments, there are a couple of notable ones. Firstly, Facet of Dawn will cause your powered melee hits to grant you the Radiant buff for 4 seconds. Additionally, powered melee final blows will grant yourself and nearby allies the Radiant buff for 4 seconds. Facet of Dawn would be helpful for boosting your weapon damage after getting a melee kill, making it easier for them to get kills to refund you ability energy. Personally, however, I find Facet of Dawn's 4-second Radiant duration to just be too short for my liking when used with this build. It's not a particularly bad fragment, I just find its use cases for me personally to be too rare to outweigh any of the prescriptive fragments I've chosen. Second, for alternative fragments, Facet of Protection will grant you an overall 15% damage resistance to all incoming damage while within 15 meters of 3 or more enemies. Facet of Protection can be a very helpful fragment if you find yourself dying often, as its damage resistance will be procced constantly with this build thanks to its melee range nature. I find Woven Mail's damage resistance to be plenty enough resistance for me personally, but Facet of Protection is fantastic for keeping you alive, especially if your Lightning Surge didn't kill the enemies you used it on. Facet of Protection also comes with a 10-point boost to your Strength stat, which would help your Arcane Needle passively recharge faster. With the entire subclass setup now detailed, I'll get into the artifact mods to run during Act 1 of episode Revenant. Firstly, the Concussive Reload mod will cause any damage dealt to bosses and champions, as well as the destruction of combatant shields, to weaken the enemy damaged for 20 seconds. This weaken effect is a 15% debuff and will cause the enemy afflicted to take 15% more damage for the weakened debuff's duration. Concussive Reload is fantastic for this build as it takes advantage of 2 grenade launchers in the form of Forbearance and Edge Transit. Having both weapons apply weaken to bosses and champions, or to enemies whose shields you've destroyed, will simply allow you to deal more damage for that weaken effect's duration. The second artifact mod to equip is Kinetic Impacts. Kinetic Impacts will cause rapid hits against one enemy with a heavy grenade launcher to trigger a shockwave beneath the enemy, dealing damage to the enemy and stunning unstoppable champions. Unfortunately, at the moment, Kinetic Impact is bugged and isn't working entirely as intended. According to the latest This Week in Destiny article, which I will link in the description, Kinetic Impacts currently isn't working with all heavy grenade launchers, the shockwave isn't dealing enough damage, and the shockwave is taking too much damage to proc. However, Kinetic Impact does work at the moment with Edge Transit, and while it's not dealing as much damage as it's supposed to, it's still free damage that you wouldn't get otherwise, as well as allowing Edge Transit to stun unstoppable champions. It's a worthwhile mod to use even in its currently bugged state, especially as there aren't any other 5th column artifact mods this build can take advantage of. Third for artifact mods is Rapid Impacts. Rapid Impacts will cause any damage dealt with any type of grenade launcher to grant you a stack of the Rapid Impacts buff. Rapid Impacts can stack up to 5 times. While you have any stacks of Rapid Impacts, your grenade launchers will be granted a buff to their reload speed and their reload duration multiplier. These buffs are increased when you have more stacks of Rapid Impacts. Rapid Impacts simply allows you to reload your grenade launchers much faster while it's active, making them much less cumbersome to use as often as this build uses them. Lastly, for artifact mods, the Trace Evidence mod will cause 2 precision hits against arc debuffed enemies, or 3 rapid kills against arc debuffed enemies to summon an Ionic Trace. Trace Evidence has an intrinsic 4-second cooldown, meaning it can't generate more than 1 Ionic Trace every 4 seconds. However, this is simply a free Ionic Trace, and as this build jolts enemies with both the Lightning Surge melee and the Storm Grenade thanks to Facet of Dominance, you'll be able to collect Trace Evidence's Ionic Trace pretty much off cooldown. Onto the episode Revenant tonic to use when running this build, the Diluted or Refined Tonic of Amplified Arc should be chosen. These tonics will boost the Trace Evidence artifact mod, which will cause it to grant you a stack of armor charge instantly upon the collection of any Ionic Trace with no cooldown. Unfortunately, this build doesn't make use of an arc primary ammo weapon, nor does it take advantage of the Retinal Burn artifact mod, so you won't get any use out of the rest of the tonic's buffs. However, the free armor charge granted by this tonic is nice to have, and I'll explain why when I go over the armor's mod setup later in the video. With the entire subclass setup now detailed, I can get into the armor's setup for this build, starting with stat distribution. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience first, with Recovery second, and ignore Mobility altogether. Resilience is the most important stat to spec into in the top 3 stat grouping. Resilience dictates your total amount of health and shields, as well as your overall damage resistance, which makes it a great stat for use with this build. This build makes use of Woven Mail often, which further increases damage resistance, so having Resilience at its max will further increase your overall survivability immensely. Paired with Devour's healing capabilities, Max Resilience and Woven Mail will keep you alive through even the incredibly annoying fire stomps every single boss in the game seems to have these days. Second in the top 3 stat grouping, Recovery dictates the delay between taking damage and the start of your health regeneration, as well as increasing the rate at which you regenerate your health. Higher tiers of Recovery positively affect these values. Furthermore, Recovery is the Warlock's class stat, meaning higher tiers of Recovery will decrease your Phoenix Dive's base cooldown. At base, Phoenix Dive has a 55-second cooldown, but all the way up at tier 10 Recovery, your Phoenix Dive will regenerate passively in only 32 seconds. Base cooldowns don't affect active ability energy gains like Ionic Traces, but having the base cooldown higher will allow it to recharge faster when you aren't actively regenerating the ability itself. I personally don't have my recovery at tier 10. In fact, my recovery with this build is only tier 6, which gives me a 46-second Phoenix Dive cooldown. However, when paired with Ionic Traces, Phoenix Dive is still always available when I find myself needing it, so you don't have to spec too heavily into recovery to still get the most out of your Phoenix Dive class ability. Lastly, in the top 3 stat grouping is Mobility. Mobility is by far the least important stat to spec into in the top 3 stat grouping, as all Mobility does is increase your walking, strafing, and crouching movement speeds, as well as your initial jump height. All of these are unimportant for this build, and as such, Mobility itself is unimportant. However, I do recommend having at least 30 points in Mobility, as that will ensure your jumps don't land short of particularly long distance or high height jumps. In the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Strength first, with Discipline as a close second, and ignore Intellect altogether. Strength will be the most important stat to spec into in the bottom 3 stat grouping, as Strength dictates the base cooldown of your melee ability. I will reiterate that base cooldowns have no effect on active ability generation, however, the higher tier your Strength stat is, the faster your Arcane Needle will charge when you aren't able to generate any active ability energy. Second in priority for stats in the bottom 3 stat grouping, Discipline will dictate the base cooldown of your grenade ability. Again, its base cooldown has no effect on active ability energy gains, but the higher Discipline stat is, the faster it'll recharge when you can't generate any active ability energy. Lastly, in the bottom 3 stat grouping is Intellect. Intellect will lower the base cooldown of your super, but it does nothing besides that, so don't even bother putting any points into Intellect. Keep it at tier 3 if you can, as that will ensure your super's cooldown isn't any longer than its base, but try not to go any higher than tier 3 either. With the armor's stats now detailed, I'll get into the armor's mod setup for this build, starting with the helmet's mods. Firstly, the Arc Siphon mod will cause rapid arc weapon final blows to summon an Orb of Power. This Orb of Power will grant you super energy, Woven Mail via the Facet of Purpose fragment, melee energy thanks to the Invigoration mod in your legs, and health via the Recuperation mod in your legs. Similarly, the 2 Kinetic Siphons will cause rapid Kinetic Weapon final blows to summon a more potent Orb of Power. The potency of the orb only affects its super energy gains, so Kinetic Siphon orbs will grant you more super energy than the Arc Siphon orb will. However, the rest of the buffs granted by Orbs of Power remain the same between the two. The Siphon mods are helpful, as generating and collecting Orbs of Power is a large part of this build's overall effectiveness. Orbs don't help in one specific area particularly well, but they help in a lot of areas a little bit, making them worthwhile to generate and collect as often as you can. Next, on your arms, the 2 heavy-handed mods together will cause a potent Orb of Power to be summoned upon getting a kill with your powered melee attack. Lightning Surge's Slide Melee counts as a powered melee attack, so you don't have to use Arcane Needle specifically to generate this Orb of Power. With 2 heavy-handed mods equipped, Heavy-Handed itself will incur a 5-second cooldown between orb generations. This means you can only generate 1 Orb of Power via Heavy-Handed every 5 seconds, but that won't be too big a deal as you'll have a melee charge up once every 5 seconds anyways. You will lose out on orb generation slightly if you get powered melee kills more often than once every 5 seconds, so if you want, you can run 3 heavy-handed mods to lower the cooldown to 1 second. However, personally, I find the loss of a plus 10 stat mod to be more detrimental than the infrequent loss of an Orb of Power, so I just run 2 heavy-handed mods. Onto your chest pieces mods, simply running whatever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. For general low-level content, I usually just run 1 Arc, 1 Solar, and 1 Void resistance mod. But when running higher difficulty content, or any content with a threat modifier, I will change my resistance mods accordingly. In higher difficulty content, it's smart to think of what enemy type you'll be fighting against, as they generally have 1 or 2 main sources of damage. An example is the Scorn. Scorn have significant arc damage sources like Screebs, Stalkers, Arc Chieftains, and Abominations. As that's the case, when going into an activity wherein you'll be fighting Scorn, bring 2 arc resistances and 1 of a separate damage type you know you'll be subject to. Generally a Void resistance mod, as the Scorn Raider crossbows can deal a lot of damage very quickly. The same goes for threat modifiers. Run 2 resistance mods that correspond with the activity's threat modifier, and run 1 separate resistance mod of a damage type you know you'll be subject to. For your leg mods, firstly, the Invigoration mod will grant your Arcane Needle 6% melee energy instantly upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. Again, this may seem like a small amount of melee energy, but this build will be generating and collecting orbs of power frequently. This 6% energy simply increases your Arcane Needle's uptime, and by extension, your Lightning Surge's uptime as well. Invigoration is also a good mod to bring in group activities. When playing in a group, you won't always be able to actively generate ability energy yourself, as your fire team members will be killing enemies too. Thus, having Invigoration equipped allows you to gain ability energy when your teammates get kills and generate orbs of power themselves. Next, the Void Weapon Surge mod will grant your Edge Transit a 10% boost to its damage while you have any stacks of armor charge. This simply serves to increase your Edge Transit's outgoing damage potential. This is helpful for boss damage, as this build is designed more for ad clearing than it is for putting out damage on bosses. Lastly, the Recuperation mod will grant you 70 health instantly upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. Recuperation is a great survivability mod. While this build does make use of the Devour buff to heal to full health upon getting a kill, it doesn't have any passive healing. That makes Recuperation a really helpful mod for health when there aren't any enemies around to kill for Devour, but there are still uncollected orbs laying around on the ground. Lastly, for your Bonds mods, the 2 Outreach mods will work together to grant you 10.2% melee ability energy instantly upon the use of your Phoenix Dive class ability. This isn't a mod to use actively by any means. Instead, it's simply brought to help you regenerate some melee energy when you use your Phoenix Dive. In my experience with this build, I only find myself needing to use Phoenix Dive when I don't have a melee charge available, so the Outreach mods have been helpful to me for regenerating that melee charge. Next, the Time Dilation mod by itself will cause your decaying armor charge stacks to each last 50% longer. This increases each stack's duration to 15 seconds instead of its base of 10. Time Dilation isn't overwhelmingly important, especially not so if you've remembered to apply a Tonic of Amplified Arc. That'll boost the Trace Evidence Artifact mod, which will grant you an armor charge every time you collect an Ionic Trace. Now that I've detailed the Armor's mod setup, I'll get into my recommendations for weapon choice for this build. I'll go over each slot in order, from kinetic to energy and then power, detailing my prescriptive weapon choice and why I've chosen that specific weapon. Once I've done that, I'll then give a few alternative options if you don't have those weapons, don't want to use those weapons, or otherwise want to use something different. In the kinetic slot, the Monte Carlo Exotic Auto Rifle is the perfect weapon for this build. Monte Carlo has the exotic perk Monte Carlo Method, which causes every hit with Monte Carlo itself to regenerate 1.2% Arcane Needle energy instantly. Furthermore, every kill with Monte Carlo grants a 25% chance to instantly grant you a fixed 100% melee ability energy. Monte Carlo's exotic trait, Markov Chain, is effectively a souped-up combination of the Swashbuckler and Grave Robber perks. Upon getting a kill with Monte Carlo, you'll be granted a stack of Markov Chain, which will cause Monte Carlo to deal increased damage. Markov Chain can stack up to 5 times, and at its maximum of 5 stacks, Monte Carlo receives a 65% boost to outgoing damage. Additionally, when you get a powered melee kill, you'll instantly receive 5 stacks of Markov Chain, and Monte Carlo itself will fully reload its magazine. Lastly, Monte Carlo's catalyst, arguably the most important part of Monte Carlo, is called Bayonet Locked, and it will allow you to hold your reload input while you have 5 stacks of the Markov Chain buff. Upon doing so, your melee ability will be replaced with a bayonet charge for a single melee attack. The bayonet charge counts as an unpowered melee attack, and upon damaging an enemy with the attack, you'll be instantly refunded a fixed 50% melee ability energy. Overall, Monte Carlo is an incredible weapon for use with this build, and will serve very nicely to increase your melee ability's uptime. I honestly don't shoot with the weapon itself all that much. I only find myself shooting it when I'm completely out of any ability charges, and I need to refund myself my melee ability to either continue or restart my ability loop. The bayonet charge is really fun to use and actually deals a surprising amount of damage. Plus, its melee regeneration is super helpful, and it'll serve to keep your melee energy up much more frequently. All in all, Monte Carlo is a great weapon, and it's fairly central to the whole build's ability spam capabilities. However, if you don't want to use Monte Carlo, don't like it, or don't have its catalyst, there are some legendary weapons you can bring in its place. For those weapons, pretty much anything with the Pugilist perk will work. Pair that with either the Grave Robber or Swashbuckler perks, and you'll effectively have a less effective Monte Carlo. Specific weapons that can roll those combination of perks are the Liminal Vigil Stasis Sidearm from the Spire of the Watcher dungeon, the Prolonged Engagement Stasis Submachine Gun from the Vanguard weapon pool, the Sununa SI-6 Stasis Sidearm from the World Drop weapon pool, and the Showrunner Kinetic Submachine Gun from the World Drop weapon pool. For your energy slot, the Forbearance Arc Waveframe Grenade Launcher with the perk combination of Ambitious Assassin and Chain Reaction should be chosen. You could also run it with other perks as well. Demolitionist works well in the 3rd column, and Wellspring works in the 4th column. I have a role with Demolitionist and Wellspring on it, however, and sure, it grants more ability energy when you get kills, but you aren't getting as many kills without Chain Reaction, and you aren't getting those kills as fast without Ambitious Assassin. As such, I prefer just the Ambitious Assassin and Chain Reaction rule, but you can try out different permutations to see which ones you like more. All that aside though, the main reason Forbearance is brought, and also the main reason the Needlestorm Super is chosen, is because of its origin trait, Indomitability. Indomitability will cause any kill with the weapon to grant ability energy based on the element of the super you have equipped. Light supers will grant grenade energy on kill, and darkness supers will grant melee energy on kill. Specifically, you'll get 3% melee ability energy every time you get a kill with Forbearance, so it's a very good weapon to have. Also, this Forbearance is the one from the Onslaught activity, not the Vow of the Disciple raid, making it much easier to farm for. Simply go to Zavala in the tower, attune to Forbearance, and run some Onslaught under the Vanguard Operations icon to hunt for a good roll. If you don't have Forbearance, don't like Waveframe grenade launchers, or simply want to use something else, there are alternative options. Perks you can hunt for include Grave Robber, Pugilist, Swashbuckler, and Trench Barrel on shotguns. 1-2 Punch unfortunately doesn't increase either Arcane Needle or Lightning Surge's damage, so it's not worth having. As for specific weapons that can roll combinations of those perks, there are the Aberrant Action Solar Rocket Assisted Sidearm from Episode Echoes, the Dead Weight Arc Shotgun from the Gambit weapon pool, the Iterative Loop Arc Fusion Rifle from the Niamuna weapon pool, and the Ikelos SG V3 Solar Shotgun from the Season of the Seraph, now acquirable via the Operation Seraph's Shield exotic mission. Onto the heavy slot, the Edge Transit Void Grenade Launcher from the Onslaught weapon pool, with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Envious Assassin, should be brought. However, it doesn't need to be Edge Transit specifically. Any DPS rolled grenade launcher will work in this slot. Perks like Explosive Light, Bait and Switch, Frenzy, and to a lesser extent Vorpal Weapon will all work well when applied on a heavy GL. As for specific GLs that can roll those perks as an alternative to Edge Transit, there are the A Cosmic Void Grenade Launcher from the Festival of the Lost event, the Bittersweet Arc Grenade Launcher from Episode Revenant, the Caraxes' Distress Strand Grenade Launcher from the Root of Nightmares raid, the Marsilian Sea Solar Grenade Launcher from the World Drop weapon pool, the Typhon GL5 Stasis Grenade Launcher from the World Drop weapon pool, and the Wicked Sister Strand Grenade Launcher from the Vanguard weapon pool. With the entire build now detailed, I'll get into a few tips and tricks I've learned about this build in my time playing it to help you get the most out of it. The very first thing to do is, as soon as you get a Lightning Surge kill, hold your reload input to ready the Monte Carlo's bayonet. Not only will it help you almost instantly kill any majors or elites your Lightning Surge didn't do enough damage to, but it'll also stay readied for as long as you want. You can only ready the bayonet while you have 5 stacks of Markov chain, but once it is readied, you don't need to worry about it. This means even if you don't use your bayonet charge right away, you'll have it when you want to use it. Next, it's best practice to use your abilities as soon as they're charged, because if you don't, you're just wasting potential energy gains. This is especially true for your Storm Grenade. Using your abilities off cooldown also usually means you'll kill more enemies, meaning you'll generate more ability energy overall. Also, never waste all of your abilities on an enemy you're not going to kill. If you go into a damage phase, don't just dump all of your abilities into the boss. Throw your Storm Grenade if you've got it, use a Lightning Surge if you want, but save at least one ability for when the damage phase ends. That way you can restart your Devour chain instantly and don't have to worry about building up charge exclusively using Monte Carlo or Forbearance without the aid of Devour or Ionic Traces. Anyways, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments section. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. If you'd like to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing. Lastly, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, or simply play some Destiny with us, you can learn more about that by joining our Discord server. The link is in the description. Again, thank you for watching and have a great day.